Okay, this is recording. So, hello everybody. It's a Friday in San Francisco, and we're recording another session of How I Build Data Products. Today we have Arvind Ramesh from Envoy. Arvind is currently the manager of the data team at Envoy, and I know he believes in that the most important skill in data is storytelling, and that data teams should operate more like software engineering teams. Arvind, I know you have a dog called Casper and that you like to play a board game with friends, but it's great to have you on the video call here. Thank you so much. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning to you. No, it's great to be here. Always excited to share whatever learnings I can.
Yeah, we're pretty excited to learn about what you do at Envoy, and let me do a short background on Envoy before we start. I think everybody here in San Francisco knows about Envoy, but maybe, it always helps to get a little bit of background. I'm going to share my screen real quick, what you guys do. And I think you guys, it's fair to say that I think your boilerplate says that you transform, you build transformative technology for a world-class workplace, challenging the status quo to make modern office life and work more meaningful, right? You're redefining how offices manage visitors and deliveries in over 13,000 locations around the globe while building for a new era of workplace innovation. I think here in SF, everybody's familiar with the check-ins on iPads that we see in every lobby here. I personally use Passport, the iPhone app that allows for a completely seamless check-in. It's amazing. And that's the product experience here. If nobody for those people here, you can check it out what Envoy does. This is the little, this is the iPad here, where you can check in. That's your product. And but before, I think that's enough background for the company. Arvind, let's dive right in. Today we're going to talk about data products at Envoy, but maybe you can start with a little bit of background on yourself, how you got into data, what your background is, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. So my background is, so I've been at Envoy for about 3 years, coming up on 3 years. I was one of the first hires on the data team here. Obviously, when you join a company that early, a lot of the initial work is just setting up some basic infrastructure, getting some data into an ingestion pipeline, getting some tools in place. Obviously that was 3 years ago. Now we have an actual team, and we're obviously doing a lot more things. It's more exciting, a little more complex. Before Envoy, I was at a company called Intercom on the finance and analytics team. And that was the first job in tech, I would say. The first time I was at a startup environment, kind of see how things move a lot faster, and how the variety of tools is a lot bigger. And it was kind of like my first entry into the data space, let's call it. And then before that, my first job was at a company called BlackRock, which is it's in the financial services industry. It's at 12,000 employees. Did investment strategy there, so a little bit different, but you got to start somewhere, and then and now I'm here.
Now you're at Envoy, right? Great. So 13,000 locations, many different countries. I'm sure that makes for some interesting data challenges, but can we maybe talk about real quick, data products? I know your stack, and let's have you talk about your stack a little bit, but what do you consider data products at Envoy, and how does it deliver value to the business? Can you maybe talk a little bit about what you've built and maybe a few specific data products?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think in defining a data product, it's maybe useful to start out by talking about what is not a data product, right? So typically, if you do a piece of analysis, or you do some research, or you do some reporting, that is very valuable, but I would say that falls in the category of not a data product, right? Because the end deliverable there is sort of the insight or the information, and you use that to make some decision. A data product, on the other hand, at least the way I look at it, it's not really delivering an insight per se, but it's delivering a thing that can be used by other people within or outside of the company to improve their workflow, right? So the one example that I wanted to maybe talk about a little bit here was recently we have a tool called Gainsight that customer success team got set up. And what Gainsight is, it basically is sort of a UI that allows you to better manage your customer base, see how people are using your product, where there are problems, where you might need to focus your attention. But the whole premise of this is that it needs to, you need to feed it a lot of product data, a lot of customer data, and it all needs to be reliable, accurate, and pretty comprehensive. So obviously our team was, helped get that set up. And I think the way we did that might be informative to other people who are thinking about building data products, right? And the reason I view that as a data product is like we built this pipeline, we built this, basically the system that allows other people to more easily access data and use it in their workflow without us having to, sort of go back and forth and be like, here's this piece of research, here's this piece of insight, customers asking for this, oh, let me give you this piece, right? So it's kind of like enabling people to do more with the data that we have.
Got it. And Gainsight is a SaaS product, right? Is that correct?
Yeah. It is a SaaS product, and it's typically used by people in the customer success field. Typically, the setup here, and it's not uncommon, is that we have a few customer success managers, and each of them will have several hundred accounts, maybe, and they'll maybe have personal relationships, check in with each one, and like what Gainsight helps to do is every time there's a check-in, like, okay, this company, maybe you could be using these features, you're not really using these ones as much, like, and the way our business model is set up, you pay by location, and there will be companies that, maybe have like 50 offices. And it's useful for a customer success manager to sit there and be like, okay, you have 50 offices, but look, these 5 are actually having some issues, and maybe you should focus on these. And the ability for them to say that is obviously enabled by all the product usage data that we're generating on a daily basis.
So that's super useful, because in SaaS, your churn rate, I mean, if you end up with having unhappy customers and they churn, that's one of the biggest issues in SaaS, right? So if you keep your churn rate low, that's important for the business. So then the data that goes into Gainsight, then that's the data your team prepares, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Gainsight is like, the way I think of it is basically the UI that sits on top of it, right? Because like, it would not be the best use of our time or anyone's time to basically build a UI for that kind of thing. So typically in terms, again, the way we think of data products is like, usually it'll be like the backend data service or data infrastructure. And then the actual last mile where it's like a web dashboard or something, usually we'll use a tool or like some other way to accomplish that.
Great. So if I would describe this back to you, you've built a platform now that on top of that, you can build different data products and data experiences. One use case is Gainsight, right? And so I assume because you guys have built this data platform, it's highly rich data that your customer success reps now get in Gainsight, right? And the UI, the value add that Gainsight brings to the table is the UI. You don't need to build the last mile, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And then one thing I would add is sort of the data platform that you alluded to. Gainsight is one example, but we also have many other things. Like we use a marketing automation tool called Intercom, which is very similar in that, it does a bunch of stuff, but it requires a lot of rich customer data to be useful. So it's like the same platform that kind of powers that. We use another tool called Matic, which basically will programmatically build slide decks, and a lot of the information in these slide decks is like usage information, customer information, and so it will just pull from this data platform that we've set up.
Great. So you mentioned rich data, rich customer data. With this image in mind now, can you talk a little bit about the data sources you have and how you go from the raw data all the way to a customer success rep looking at data in Gainsight? Can you walk us through that stack and the sources?
Yeah. So in terms of loading, so I guess to directly answer your question, we probably have like, I would say more than 20 to 25 sources of data. And this ranges from, we have multiple products. Each product will have its own database. We use a bunch of third-party services, and we use sort of data loading tools like Stitch and Fivetran to load that data into our Redshift cluster. And Redshift is our data warehouse. So we basically use tools for data loading. And there's a few cases where there was no integration available. We use a framework called Singer to build it ourselves.
Okay.
So all the data lands in Redshift, and obviously, anyone who's worked with data, you probably quickly realize that typically data in its raw format is not ideal to do anything with, right? Like typically a lot of these APIs will return data that is not optimized or useful for analysis. It'll have random like hashes, random keys. So then on top of that, once all the data is loaded into Redshift, we use a transformation framework called dbt to actually build all our transformations and like output these final models is what we call them. They're essentially new tables that are actually much more useful if you look at them, right? Like, so if you look at a given company, in our company's model, you will see like, okay, how much is this company paying? When were they last active with us? What features are they using? Which ones are they not using, et cetera, et cetera. Versus, if you were just relying on raw data, that would probably live in like 30 or 40 different places.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. DBT obviously is very hot right now.
Yeah.
A lot. Can I go back to those 20 to 25 sources?
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned how you use Stitch and I think you said Fivetran, correct? Fivetran as well. Can you talk a little bit about those sources in terms of like, where do you use standardized tools versus where you invest into building a bespoke pipeline? And how dynamic is it? Like, is it those 20 sources, 20 to 25? Do they always stay the same? Is there a new one every month? Like, how's that playing out for you?
Yeah. So in terms of, loading data, our general philosophy has been that is sort of a solved problem. And tools like Stitch and Fivetran, if you were to replicate the functionality on your own, you would probably have to be up to date on many, many different APIs. You would have to maintain a lot of infrastructure on your own. They're probably at a certain scale, it's worth it to do that, a certain scale and complexity and SLA requirements. But typically, just in terms of the loading portion, like we just believe that there are tools out there and there's a solved problem and there's not much of a need to invest in doing that yourself. A lot of these tools can load data, up to every 30 minutes even, and that level of SLA is perfectly fine for where we are and our data consumers. And then in terms of, DBTs, it's maybe a little bit more of a bespoke solution. And the thinking there is like, a lot of data transformations are very business specific. Later in this interview, I can share my screen and show you a portion of our DBT project, but there's so much like domain specific knowledge that goes on. Like even in this Gainsight example I was telling you about, like you really have to understand like, how our business works, like how our activation metrics are defined, how our products kind of interact with each other. So that's typically where we do sort of a lot of the work on our end.
Got it. So these tools like Fivetran and Stitch and the framework Singer, they allow you to abstract a lot of the abstract away from the plumbing, right? So get data in. Yeah. And then DBT allows you also to build. So I assume like you use DBT for the transformations, but also for custom data ingest in some cases. Is that correct? Or
no. So DBT doesn't do any ingestion. It just does the in warehouse transformation.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and in the few areas where we need to do custom ingestion, like if there's not an existing integration for it, we'll basically build a script using the Singer framework, and we have an Airflow instance running, and we'll just host like a thing on there. Got it.
Okay, great. That's great background. Okay. Can you give so you mentioned that domain-specific knowledge is really important, and that seems to be where a lot of the value creation happens with your team, right?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit how that process happens, how you get that domain knowledge and put it into your DBT models?
Yeah. So, I guess this also goes into a little bit of the team structure.
Yes.
And, so our data team is kind of like a hub and spoke model. So we're all one team. There's about, I think 7 or 8 of us combined, including myself. But then the reason I call it hub and spoke is like each person will work very closely with a given product team or a given business team. So, just to take one guy who works he works very closely with our marketing team. So he's sort of in all their meetings. We'll sort of be very like in lockstep with them and how they set their goals and what they're looking at. So when it comes to modeling marketing data, if you were to build like a few DBT models on how to do marketing attribution, it will be easier. And the way we work is like, we'll make a PR and then somebody else will review it. And, through the sort of collaborative review process, that knowledge starts to get disseminated across the team. So it's typically like one person is like really the expert, but like slowly, since everything is version controlled, everything's on Git, that knowledge starts to make its way across the team. One of the things you alluded to at the beginning of the interview was how data teams, I think data teams should work more like software engineering teams. This is a very common concept, right?
Yeah.
in the software engineering world. This is how they disseminate knowledge all the time, right?
Yeah.
Through QA or through reviewing PRs, and that's like a similar approach that we've taken.
Got it. Can you shed some light on your team size and what the different roles are, and who you interact with, and maybe also in relationship to overall employee count, if there's I don't know if there's a ratio or anything?
Yeah. So our team is 8 people, and that's split across data engineering, product analytics, and go-to-market analytics. Obviously, there's overlap across all of us, but that's generally how it breaks down. And in terms of percentage of the company, we are about 170 people right now. If I'm doing my math right, it's about 5% of the team is on data related roles. And there's actually a great blog post on the DBT blog, which kind of interviews a bunch of people and gets a sense of how big their data team is and what the structure is. So it seems like the general range is probably like 2 to 7%. So we're about in that range. And obviously, if we build our systems if we continue to invest in building scalable systems, like hopefully, the data team does not have to scale one-to-one with the rest of the company.
At some point.
And that goes back to some of the reasons we're talking about data products, right? Like building one data product can reduce a lot of workload from your team that allows you to focus on research and, building more high impact things.
Right. So going back to the Gainsight model, if you trace it back to the source, they need data from your production app, like how your customers use your production app, right?
Yeah.
And then you take that data, you ingest it into Redshift, you have your models in DBT. Any other data that goes into that for your customer success team for Gainsight? What are some of the core data sources?
So there's a bunch of data from our production databases. There's data from our customer support tools like ticket volumes and such. There's data from our billing system. There's data from obviously our Salesforce app. There's data from even our email systems. Right. And if I could share my screen really quickly, I can kind of show you sort of
what
the pipeline looks like. Let's see if I can. Yeah. All right. Can you kind of see things?
Yes, you can see it. Perfect.
So this obviously looks like a pretty big mess, but what each one of these nodes is actually a data transformation. You can think of it as basically a block of SQL. And obviously, the way a DAG works, it's taking the output of the previous node, doing something to it, and then making it accessible for a downstream model. Right? And then this node here is it's called Gainsight Company Facts. This is one of the final tables that we will finally unload to S3 and is now accessible for Gainsight to access. Right? And what's specifically in this table is for every company, for every day, it'll have a bunch of key data points about them, right? And you can see where it gets that information is a whole bunch of places. And everything that's green here is a different raw data table. So, obviously it's too much to go into every single one, but you can kind of see how many tables and how many transformations there are. And it looks crazy when you sort of look at it like this, but sort of having some best principles and best practices and documentation and testing actually allows us to manage this pretty well.
Right. And then this is the result, the structure is the result of the domain-specific knowledge that you acquire from your internal customers.
Yep.
And you have this process, you write PRs and everything is documented, and that's how you come up with this DAG, with this transformation that looks really complex right now, but there's a logic behind it. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, I would say that's roughly correct. And again, this wasn't built overnight, right? There's portions of this, maybe the billing portion and a portion that relates to a specific feature that were probably already existing, right? And then when we go to build this Gainsight stuff, when we need to pull data from all these various sources, many things are already there for us, and we can just sort of build on top.
Interesting. What struck me is, so you run this transformation in your data warehouse, right? In Redshift. This runs in Redshift, right?
Yeah.
And then you unload the result into S3, correct?
Yeah, and that's more of a Gainsight specific thing. But sort of we take the final models here. Taking this one as an example, and DBT has this thing called post hooks where we can take the output and unload it to a designated S3 bucket. And that's a Gainsight specific thing, but if another tool needs it in a different format, we can also facilitate it that way. The key part is all of the logic is sort of encapsulated into this web, right? And then we can just take whatever this is and like unload it to S3, or maybe we need to query it, you know, and send that same data through an API, or, you know, what have you.
Yeah, got it. So then question, how often do you update this final result? Like how fresh can you talk a little bit about metrics? Like how often does it happen? How long does it take? What
Yeah,
happens
yeah.
if it doesn't work?
So this particular one, it takes, we run it every day, and it takes about 40 minutes to run. And in this particular, I think we actually run all the upstream dependencies as well. So it's like the most fresh possible data. There are situations where, you know, we would only run a subset of things to make the SLA a little bit faster. But at least for, you know, again, keeping it to this specific Gainsight data product, it's sort of needed every day. So we run it every day. There are other data products, if you will, that we run every 3 hours, because the sort of the way that data is used is a little more real time. And then, you know, someday we might get to even shorter than that. And, you know, we'll think about ways how to keep reducing that latency.
Yeah. But so far, once a day, people are happy. That fulfills the business need, right?
Yeah. Typically what and again, this is more of a, you know, learning being in data. Typically it's pretty rare for people to truly need data like real time or even close to real time, right? Unless it's like really something operational, or like you're looking at, you know, server metrics. It's pretty rare for something to be really needed more than on a daily basis.
Yeah, makes total sense. Now, with all of this in place now, and you know, you came into the picture 3 years ago at Envoy. What are some of the lessons learned in building this, and where would you say, gosh, I wish I would have known that back then, what I know now?
Yeah.
And also maybe give a perspective on the different tools, because, you know, 3 years is a huge amount of time and data right now. There's been so much innovation. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit? What happened in those 3 years? What you know now, what you didn't know back then?
Yeah, I mean, it's always an iterative process. And, you know, a lot of the learnings that I'm going to say are probably pretty cliche around like testing and documentation. But, you know, to kind of give you a little summary of the journey that we took to get here, you know, the first issue that we ran into was like we build all these models and then some of them break for whatever reason. The upstream data is incorrect. So then we're like, okay, you know, let's implement some testing. So then we implemented tests on a bunch of models, like checking if keys are unique, making sure they're not null, adding some, you know, specific custom logic on testing these things. Like, okay, that solves that problem. The next problem is like, okay, now we have all these tests. When some of them fail, it's not really evident like who on the team is responsible. They go unfixed for a long time. So then it was like, okay, we implemented like a QA rotation, right? Again, very similar to how engineering does things. So every week there's someone else who is responsible for fixing any data tests that issues that pop up, right? So then we have that going, and then you know, as the company keeps scaling, the team keeps growing. Now we have so many tests that when somebody fails, when that test fails, the person who is responsible for fixing it may not understand the full logic that's going on, right? So then it's like, okay, now we need to start adding documentation on how to debug tests and documentation on how things are built. And again, like I keep drawing this parallel, but our engineering team, if you open up our knowledge base, it has a postmortem for every outage. It has a postmortem for every issue that happens and how to fix it, right?
Yeah.
And it's a similar thing that we've done too. So now tests will have like documentations on how to fix it. All these models in that DAG that you saw, every node will have some, you know, at least some description on like, what does this thing do? Why is it used? And this is kind of a process to get to where we're at today. And it's obviously, you know, it's never perfect, but that's kind of how, like, you know, each time we see an issue, we've done something to address it. And now what that looks like is like we have regular testing for all this stuff. We have we have documentation that's added with each PR. And that's kind of helped keep all the complexity manageable.
Yeah. Great. I have a couple more questions on your team. You talked about data engineers, product analytics, and marketing analytics. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, so we have data engineering, we have product analytics, and then what I call like go-to-market analytics. So it's like sales, marketing, success, support. That's all put all that in a bucket, I would say.
Yeah, and the data engineers focus on the pipeline part, the ingest, and also the transformations in dbt. Is that their role?
Yeah, I mean, so their role is kind of like, when we build all these models, ensuring that we're always doing it in the best possible way. Like, we're hitting the sort keys of this table because we use Redshift,
Yeah.
making sure that, things are grouped and like just written, the SQL is written in a very optimized way. They kind of serve as like the experts on all this type of stuff. Sort of on the borders, like if we really do need to make some modification, like we recently used AWS Glue to offload a certain portion of our pipeline that involved a very large data source. We need to do some pre-processing before it landed in our warehouse. Like that, a data engineer would typically take on. So it's kind of projects that are more on the little more technical side, but everyone is still responsible for building their own models and like writing their own tests. So the core workflow is the same for everyone, but where data engineers really help is like on the margins, right? And serve as sort of the technical expert for many of these things.
Got it. I hear you getting pinged on Slack.
Sorry, yeah, let me turn that
No,
off.
it's all good. Like, we've had plenty of time. Maybe to close, can you talk a little bit about what you see in the future here happening for you the next year, the next quarter? What are some of the challenges you guys want to tackle and aspirations with these data products?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different areas. One area is obviously leveraging this data platform that we've kind of built and taking it to the next level. So like one thing that we're working on right now is using a lot of that sort of that company data that you just saw to build like a version of a sort of like a churn prediction model. And it leverages all the same stuff, right? It basically calculates a churn probability for every company for every week. And it's going to, probably offload that, at least for now, onto Gainsight, so people can start to get a sense of like how healthy is this company. This might be getting in the weeds, but we're trying a tool called Amazon SageMaker for that. So and that's one example of using the data platform to like get a little more advanced. In this case, like churn prediction. Another thing that is we're probably going to do next year is our customer facing analytics. We're probably going to build a sort of internal microservice to basically serve that data. So obviously, when people log into Envoy, there's some analytics about how many visitors are coming to their office, how many packages they're scanning, and the data team is eventually going to build a sort of a little service where the app will just request what it wants, and then we will return like a bunch of things that we think are valuable. So that's like a little more like production facing stuff. But I think that type of work is where maybe next year we'll start to do more of.
Interesting. So that's a data microservice and it becomes part of the product experience, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And we actually already the data team already kind of owns the customer facing analytics, but it's done through one of the white labeled solution of one of our BI vendors.
Got it.
So it still sits on top of a lot of the stuff that I was showing you earlier with that pipeline.
Yeah. Arvind, this is great. Amazing information. Thank you so much. I think we're at the limit of our 30 minutes here.
Sure, yeah.
Arvind, how can people reach out best to you? Is it over LinkedIn?
Yeah, over LinkedIn is fine. My email is just arvind@envoy.com. Just quick plug for hiring. Envoy's hiring basically every technical role there is. So, if you're interested at all, just check out the jobs website. Yeah.
Well, I think you just made the case for working for Envoy because there's a lot of exciting stuff going on, right?
Yeah. That's what I like to hope for.
Arvind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check back in with you in 6 months because that data microservices project that you're working on, I think that's super exciting. We hear that a lot. But for now, thank you so much. This was super insightful. And we're recording this. I'm going to hit the pause button now. And we're going to post it on our blog. But thanks so much, Arvind. And we'll follow up here with more soon in the future.
Yeah. You got to hold me accountable for everything I just said we would do.
I will. All right.
All right, cool. Take care, Laura. Thanks for having me.
You bet.